Let's say after the 3 years of solfeggio that they did at these conservatories, then they would perhaps start partimento, but they would also do these things called intavolaturas, which you mentioned in the book. And these seem to be beginning keyboard pieces that children would learn, perhaps to learn to play on the keyboard, and they were realized simple pieces. How extensively were these beginning keyboard pieces or intavolatura used in these conservatories?
I wish I knew. It's a really good question. Everything is unclear about intavolatura. The word is the same word that guitarists use when they say a tab, a tablature.
Tablature.
Yeah, it's a tab, meaning it's a fully written out piece, unlike a partimento, And we know next to nothing about how they were used. Clearly all the composers in their late teens or early 20s could play the harpsichord well and the organ. It was just assumed. Conductors conducted from the harpsichord. And all of the chapel masters being trained in Naples were assumed to be able to take that kind of job. So you might say we know the starting point, which is 0, and we know the ending point, which is fluency on the keyboard. And we know that they did a lot of partimenti somewhere in the middle, but somehow they had to get some skill on the keyboard. And we do have this somewhat mysterious repertory of things called intavolature. Now, to make it worse, other things are also called intavolature. So I guess you would call it an educated guess.
Yeah.
Now, I actually want to go into the pedagogy of the Neapolitan method, and I asked a question of Professor Gjerdingen in a previous interview. I asked him about the role of intavolatura in the training at these conservatories, and he said it was still unclear how extensively they were used. Is there any new information about how these intavolatura were used in the conservatories, or is it just a mystery?
No, first of all, I want to clarify the word intavolatura. The intavolatura was always part of the curriculum, and in the earlier times, so let's say in the 17th century, it was just intabulation of another piece into keyboard music, of a vocal piece, for example, into keyboard music. So we don't speak about it. Just to clarify that intavolatura is another word in this context of the 18th century, is another word for pieces, for keyboard pieces. And the intavolatura are very important. I myself do research on it because I'm very intrigued. In many partimento collections, at the end, we have some keyboard pieces. Let's say you have a whole collection of partimenti, and at the end, the copyist puts there some pieces. And it's somehow, I found a quotation from 1803, I think, which says, if the student is not willing to take the pain and then he can still learn something by practicing intavolature, which in my opinion makes sense, because we have intavolatura by Greco, which they are very beautiful. The Greco's intavolatura, they are early. Greco is early partimento composer. We have intavolatura by Fenaroli. We have intavolatura by also in this Alessandro Scarlatti manuscript in Hamburg. The second half of the manuscript are intavolatura, and I think there was a need to have also some examples, although they don't seem to have a direct connection with the partimenti, but they are pieces to play the keyboard and to learn to play.
I wanted to ask you about those Fenaroli intavolatura, and I asked a few professors about them, and they said it's kind of interesting because he was a great counterpoint teacher, but how come there were some, I guess, contrapuntal mistakes, parallels in the writing of these intavolatura? Have you noticed any of those quote-unquote
Yes.
contrapunctal mistakes?
Yes, even in the Paisiello is full of it. To be honest, when Fenaroli was published in France, these mistakes were erased. In his manuscripts also, I don't think the parallels were such an issue in the practical counterpoints, especially because they were compensated by inner voice changing and so on. We have different sources which talk about it. But as soon as it was published and printed in France, it was really erased. It was very clean. And this, I can imagine that the practical part was not as narrow as when they started printing it, and especially probably in a tradition of clean and neat voice leading, you don't want to publish it. Although just Peter can talk more about it, salas, counterpoint exercises, and so on. We always encounter this issue of parallels and so on.